Hey guys, so we're coming up here on the end of season one with a couple weeks left. Kind of getting ready for season two, but first wanted to, put a bow on the season that's passed and kind of talk about all these eight dungeons that I've done a lot of, and I'm sure other people have done a lot of. So I'm joined here by my friend Brass, who tanks and has tanked a lot of keys for me, and we have done a lot of keys together this season. Maybe you've seen us on stream, you know, goofing off and whatnot, but you can say hello, Brass.
How's it going, everybody? Happy to be here.
Okay, cool. So yeah, he tanks and I heal, and that's pretty much all we do. So we have those two perspectives here um, to kind of rank these dungeons, and it'd be interesting to see like if we disagree on any of these, right?
Yeah, so we're doing a tier list, kind of rating the dungeons on, whether or not they were fun, the design, and whether or not we would want to go back again.
Yeah, something like that.
Okay, sounds good.
Yeah. So let's start here with Academy. I'm kind of conflicted about this because at least recently, like every time I come in here, it's kind of an adrenaline rush, and some of these bosses are really cool. And they're all pretty hard, I think. At least the first three are very hard, and the last boss is kind of silly, but I don't know. What do you think about Academy?
I think Algethar Academy is fun. I think they designed it well in the fact that you get plenty of opportunity to blast, right? You get to press your buttons. There's the
Yeah,
the
it's a really
trash around the
fun
tree.
DPS dungeon, for sure. Like DPS really like this dungeon, right?
Yeah, I would even argue that it's a pretty fun tank dungeon.
Okay, yeah.
Managing the trash around the tree is fun. Personally, I really enjoy tanking Croth. I know that that dungeon is less popular than some others, but managing your cooldowns correctly is super important there. And I would say that that's probably one of the bosses that made me a better tank this season.
Would you say it's like one of your top bosses? Because it's not one of mine. I like okay. So the healer perspective is I really like Veximus. I think Veximus is one of the best bosses of the season. But I can see why the tank would like Croth, right? It's a similar concept. Like it's the most challenging thing to do, right?
Yeah, I would say so. It's definitely probably my favorite. Definitely my favorite boss in the dungeon, and maybe top five bosses this season for me.
Okay, so like the boss. So okay, my problem with Croth is that it has the one shot mechanic, which I'm just not a fan of. I feel like every time they introduce something that one shots people in the game, that they should just put a different mechanic there. You know what I mean? Like it's kind of fun to dodge the tornadoes and dodge the fire and like, but then having to plan like cooldowns and shit and try to not get one shot by the screech is kind of annoying. That's really
Yeah,
my
I mean,
only gripe with the dungeon though.
we're
Um,
really fortunate that you can line of sight that. It's a little techie,
okay, I've
and
actually
you
never
have to do it
tried
right.
that. Yeah, I've never tried it. Um,
Yeah, so I mean,
but
there is a little bit of way to outplay it, but I don't do the cutting edge keys that you do. I top out 23,
mhm.
24, and when you're trying to do 26s, that definitely is a little bit more one shotty, and so maybe my perspective is a little bit different
You
if I was
definitely, I
doing
mean, you
keys
feel
that
it on
way.
23 though. Like you'll definitely feel it
Hmm.
on 23 Tyrannical. Like people have to press a personal or they're gonna die.
Yeah, I,
That
I think the for me, especially at the key ranges that I do, Broth is not the thing that ruins your key. Algethar is actually a pretty easy dungeon to complete. It's just very, very difficult to do in time. And I think that
yes,
the
yeah.
timer is the biggest boss in that dungeon. And I don't think,
So
fun or design is affected there in my rating of the dungeon. But, you know, am I excited to go back? Not really, if the timer
interesting.
doesn't change.
Interesting. Okay, so that's what I was gonna ask. Like, does the timer being 32 minutes detract from your rating? Because it does for me. Just because it, I think this dungeon is so good, and there's a lot of great design choices in here, but it's just so difficult for even. I mean, it's difficult for me to time. It's actually really difficult for the general public to time as well. It's one of the highest fail rate dungeons. Now, there's nothing wrong with that, but it's just a little bit too tight, I think.
Yeah, the timer is very punishing. There's not a lot of opportunity to just pull bigger, because whenever we see dungeons that have really tight timers, that's the solution, right? You get to
Right.
double pull, you have to triple pull,
Yeah.
and the opportunities are just not really there. We saw some snapping tech in the MDI,
Yes.
and that was a huge time save. But even in the finals, I think it was 23, the tyrannical that they were
Hmm.
doing it at, and it took them like 23 minutes to do the dungeon, and
Yeah.
that
Yeah.
doesn't feel, in the spirit of what the MDI often is, right?
There's
Because
a lot of
Ruby
like
Ruby
gaps in the
Life Bowls was
trash.
done in sub 9 minutes.
Right, right. There's a lot of gaps in the trash, and you can't really like pull it all together, right? I see what you mean.
Yep.
And the trash around Croth is just slow. Like, there's nothing to do about that.
Yeah, so that's just kind of one of those dungeons that you are just doing the dungeon, and you get to the end, and all of a sudden you're out of time. It's like, well, crap, where did we go wrong? Well,
Yeah.
nothing didn't really go wrong. It's just you ran out of time. So
All
for
right, where do we
me,
put
I,
this
th- I think
thing?
this dungeon is definitely B tier.
B
Um,
tier. I
it's
think I agree with you. It's the funny thing is for me, it's so close to being an S tier dungeon. Um, but there's just a few things that like don't quite sit right with me here, so I have to put it in B tier as well. But it's very close. And I really like they tried a few new things here, and I think they're pretty cool. Um,
what
overall.
what makes that S tier? 35-minute timer?
35 is too long. I think they should have given the AV treatment to Algethar as well. Something like 90 seconds.
34,
Um,
33 and a half.
and they should nerf. I don't know how they would nerf Croth. Also, the last boss is kind of silly. We didn't talk about this yet. It's just kind of an HP sink, right? It doesn't really do anything unless you screw it up, and then it's just kind of an annoying boss that takes 5 minutes anyway. So they should change. They should have changed the last boss somehow. I think it would make the dungeon really cool if the last boss was actually hard and also didn't take that long.
I think the last boss gets really spicy if you try to time the key and pull trash into it. I
Yeah,
think that's
yeah.
the
Um, but then the thing is, like after the trash is dead, then it's just the natty boss, right? It's just standing there,
Yep.
and you're kind of bored. It's kind of boring. I don't know.
So yeah, B tier is I'm good with that.
I like B tier.
Am I excited to go back in season 3? Probably,
I
but
I'd be
like I
happy
said,
to step in
time
again.
has got to change.
I'd be happy to step in again. I wouldn't hate it, but yeah, I like B
All right,
tier.
what do we got next?
We have Azure Vault. I think we've talked about this before, like you and I. I absolutely love this dungeon, and it really started growing on me about halfway through the season. I think it was before they nerfed it, but I started kind of understanding how the dungeon works, and how to play it properly. You know, in a coordinated setting, you can stop all the casts of all the trash, right? And you don't really take that much damage. In a good group, there's not that much damage going out because everything's being stopped, and that's a really cool dungeon in my opinion. I don't know if you agree with that. Like
Yeah,
I like
absolutely.
when that's the mechanic. Like if you play really well, then you don't take as much damage. I like that kind of mechanics.
I was a very early fan of Azure Vault. You
Okay,
know,
interesting.
when we were doing that on 12s and 13s, a couple weeks into the season, that quickly became my favorite dungeon, and that was definitely at a time where that dungeon was banned. Nobody went in there.
Yep.
Nobody timed it. It was awful. It
Right.
was most people's last 20 once we got to that level, and that was
Right.
well before it started getting nerfed. And
Well,
for me,
it was
it's
very
a
hard. It was very hard.
it
Before it
was
got
very
nerfed, I
hard,
think. Yeah, it was hard to time.
and I won't pretend that it was not hard to time, but it's a tank dungeon. If your tank plays well, you're gonna have a lot more success.
Hmm.
You have the we saw a lot of different iterations in the way that dungeon is pulled too, right? We were a
Yep.
couple weeks in, we started seeing people skip frogs, and that became the way. And honestly, I think to this day that is still the way that you do that dungeon at 20 and below.
Yes, I think.
Maybe
Yep.
even 22.
Well, once you get higher, you definitely have to do the frogs. I think,
Yeah,
which is
it's
interesting.
you don't see different routes in a lot of dungeons, especially different routes being done depending on the key level, and I think that's super
Right.
interesting.
Also with the comp, like you need a different route for different comps and stuff. I like that part so much. It's really rare that you get a dungeon these days that I mean in general, not just these days, but where you can join a different group and they just have a completely different route. And there's all these skips with the rings and stuff, which I'm not sure that they intended, but I think they did actually, right? If you think about the ring design, like I think it's intended that you can jump down, right? Um,
Yeah,
and
they had to
they
because
had
I
to.
think if you pull every if you press W and you pull everything, I think your overall count is like 150% or something like that. So
Yeah,
they definitely designed it in such a way that you have to skip something.
you got to skip
Uh,
something. Yeah,
they made it obvious with being able to skip the whelps. Like obviously you don't pull them, you don't pull the rocks.
right.
But people, when we were doing M zeros, people were like, "Oh no, 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 rocks are banned. Don't pull them.
Yeah. Oh God, he
They're not
accidentally
worth
pulled
it."
the whelp. Oh shit, we wipe.
Yep,
But
exactly.
yeah, you actually have to pull those on higher keys, and
I think
um,
you, I think people have come around on the rocks. They realize that all you gotta do is CC them, and DPS, they don't care about the rocks. It's the only
right.
thing it kills is the tank.
Yeah.
So I think most people have kind of adopted that.
Yep.
But and then that turned into the okay, now we skip frogs route,
Yeah.
and you get 100% count before the second boss. You soothe the breakers after you jump down,
Yep.
and even the skip. There's two different ways to jump down. You bring a priest or a mage and you slow fall down to the third boss, or you can walk across the ledge, jump down, and then take the book over. So even just the way that you get to the third boss is different. So
Yep.
well designed. I think it's very fun.
I think it's a lot of fun. I think the first two bosses are really, like incredibly good. I think Laymore is one of the best bosses they've ever added to the game. It's just so wonderfully designed, challenging, and in all the right ways. Does a lot of damage, and you have to plan for that. The tank has to play really well, and there's like he has to positioning, there's positioning and stuff. Sometimes you get trolled by thundering and whatnot, but overall, I just really like that boss. And I think even though the third boss is complete ass, I am an S tier believer for this. What do you think?
I would definitely agree.
Okay.
The dungeon needed nerfed a couple of times. The extra 90 seconds of the timer, uh, absolutely necessary for a lot of people. It timed a lot more keys.
Yeah. For
And
everybody. For
the
everybody.
the amount of time that you lost on the second boss, being able to not be having to do extra phases
You
because
had
of
to
the
do
timer.
one extra phase basically. They nerfed it so that you get one extra phase back. That's what
That,
they did.
that is the
Um,
perfect nerf
yes.
for that kind of
Yes.
boss where you have energy based intermissions. It was wonderful.
Yes.
It was so smart for them to do. Was really impressed. So that I slammed that dungeon as an S tier. And do I want to go back? Yes, absolutely. I
Yes.
cannot wait to go back in that dungeon in season 3.
I think we're both excited to see it in season 3 again for sure. It really, like, if you think back to the dungeons with different routing, right? Like Theater of Pain was my favorite dungeon in Shadowlands. A really kind of similar thing. You can choose. You have so much decision making, right? That, like, choice of what you want to do in the dungeon, and it's all viable. Some things may be a little faster than others, but yeah, the fact that it's all viable is really cool, I think, and really rare.
Yeah,
Okay, quarter stars.
let's do it.
So, this is obviously an older dungeon, right, from Legion. Did they change anything? I don't think so, right? It's the same dungeon from Legion, or is it a little bit different?
I believe it is mostly the same.
Okay. Um,
The only thing that changed is the trap doesn't kill one of the mini bosses
yeah.
anymore, and
Okay,
they
okay.
nerfed the engineering, um,
The orb, right?
the orb before the first bridge.
So, um, I'll say that maybe it's a fact of like running this dungeon too much, but um, kind of just boring. Not too hard, right? Um, Definitely one of the easier ones of the season, as the completion rate would show, and whatnot. But really, just for me, ended up being boring. I don't know about you.
Yeah, so the way we're ranking these with is it fun? How was the design?
Hmm.
Um, Even the tuning. I think all of those things are good. But my opinion on where Quarter Star sits in the tier list for this season in particular matters a little bit less, I guess,
Hmm.
because of it being brought back.
Because it's old,
Um,
right?
it's old, and I know that Halls of Valor is another one that has come back. However, Court of Stars also has been a time locking dungeon
We've seen a lot
for
of it. If yeah, we've
we've
seen a
seen a
lot
lot
of
of it,
it. Yeah.
and it's a little bit more difficult to rate. I think the dungeon is fun. I think it's designed very well, and there's a
Mhm.
reason why they brought it back.
Yeah.
It was very popular in Legion. They brought it back as a time walking dungeon, for good reason. It's kind of the god of loot a little bit. There's some very
Yes.
very very good items
Yep.
in that dungeon, and that matters for a lot of people too. Whenever Legion time walking came around, people slammed that dungeon trying to get the ring, slammed the dungeon trying to
To
get the
get the
trinket,
whetstone. Yep.
try to get the whetstone, and that's fun. Um, However, it's frustrating if you don't get it right, and I had that kind of carried over a little bit for a lot of people, I'm sure. So
Yeah.
I have a bit of a mixed opinion.
I'm mixed too.
It's definitely a dungeon that's better with coordinated groups. You have to be on a main who has professions.
Right.
Um, I am sure that that is not a very fun dungeon to do in the alt range. I would
In
say.
10 to 20, I mean, I've seen it, right? You try to do you pug it on your alt. Very hard. It's actually quite hard to do, right? People don't know what to interrupt and they don't know kind of the route. They don't know what to pull. They don't know the enforcers spawning on the mini boss and stuff and everyone's dead and it's like but that's I think the general experience for a lot of people with court. Does that change how we rank this?
Well, it's definitely not going to be S tier for me because there's pretty much only one way to pull it. Um,
Yes. Yeah.
the trash for the second boss, you're down, you're limited, a little bit more limited because you have to be at the mercy of the enforcer spawns, and so you do different pull combos based on where the enforcers are. Sometimes you pull one solo, sometimes you can double pull and save some time there.
Right. But
Um,
the route is like the same every time.
the route's the same every time.
Yeah.
You get to a certain key level and you start to do the dock skip. That's I think that's cool
Mhm.
and tech that people realized, and I think that adds to the flavor of the dungeon. I think that's a good thing. I'm feeling A tier mostly because it's a good dungeon. Um, we're just tired of doing it, and that kind of jades our opinion.
That's
I think
fair.
the other thing that Quarter Star suffers from a little bit is that it's definitely a homework key. If you've got a key that you run with a group and you break the key and say, okay, my 25, we didn't time it, now it's a 24, let's run that and push it up, and then for
Right.
some reason you failed that one, now you got a 23. Well, nobody needs a 23,
Yeah.
and
Okay.
now when the group breaks, now you need to go pug that key and push it back up.
That's what you mean by homework
And
key?
yep, that's a homework
Okay,
key.
okay.
And I don't. I think that's more of like a season one problem. Shadowmoon Battlegrounds, same
Yeah.
thing.
Same thing. Yeah, we'll talk about that later.
Shadowmoon and Court are homework keys, and I think that detracts from it. I feel like A tier,
Okay.
mostly because the dungeon itself. Um,
I'm somewhere here. I can't
high B or
high
low
B.
A is fine. High B
Okay.
or low A is fine
You
with
think it's
me.
better than an Academy? I think you're right.
Um,
I think you're right. I'm debating like the buff variance if that should take away from it or not. Because I think for most people it's actually cool to see different buffs, right? Then you bring different comps, or you know what
yeah,
you get what I mean, right? Like it's a little bit different every time. But I think
I think
at the
in
upper level, the buff variance is actually disliked because it really affects like it can be like the variance in key time would be quite large with different set of buffs, right? If you don't get good buffs, you can lose 2 3 minutes even, or the
yeah,
second boss is much harder, for example.
coordinated groups are pretty much always going to have the ability to get most of them. So you're never going to have a
Right,
buff that you just can't grab.
right.
I've the second or the first boss, I have definitely killed him a couple of times, like because nobody had alchemy. Right,
Yep, yep,
that's alt on a
yep. You
lower
just
level
have to,
keys.
yep, hit it down to zero.
But
Yeah.
the monk buff is really hard to get if you don't, and that's such a
Well,
good
because
buff.
yeah, Monk DK, neither of them are really in the meta right now for any of their specs,
Right.
which is kind of sad because there's a lot of Monk
Um,
DK players, and I feel like anyway,
so
that's
I
a
would say
different
that
topic.
definitely detracts from it a little bit. But for the most part, coordinator groups are going to be able to get everything that is there. Um, maybe except for the monk buff. It feels like
Yeah.
that's about the only one. So I don't think it should detract from it. I think it's
Okay.
definitely worth noting.
I like High B.
And
It's I
Hobby's
think
fine.
better than Academy. Academy has a few problems in it. Court does too, but I like it here like this. Um,
Uh, yeah, and I'm never gonna get court in my bags. On when I open my vault and go, "Oh, God, I got court." It's like, okay, I
yeah.
got court.
Okay. You're never
Let's
sad to see
let's
it.
turning into something good.
Right.
I've gotten Algethar a couple of times, and if it's a bad week, if it's a sanguine week, I'm I gotta reroll that key, man. Like it's got to be
Right.
different.
I guess we should talk. Like we should add that into our discussion. Like it, if there's some unplayable weeks for certain dungeons, that should take away from it. I think. But okay, let's move on to Hav. Hav, interesting to me as well. Kind of grew on me as the season went on because I started to learn the intricate tech and tricks in here. There's a lot of little things you have to do to save time. Um, but for me, I never like these dungeons where you have to backtrack, where you have to go to one side and then go to the other side, and like it's just not fun doing that walk. And I know they gave us the speed buff, right, and tried to make it faster, and I just don't like that kind of stuff. What about you?
The speed of helped. We really, with the way that dungeon is pulled, all you do have to do is run back to the hallway,
Yes.
right? Because you're pulling trash fairly quickly after you get back in. It's not like you're skipping all the way to the Fenrir area. You pull you pull the pack at the right end of the hall,
Right.
and maybe it's 45 seconds to run back.
I don't mean the run back is too long. I just mean like logistically and aesthetically. I don't like the concept, but
Mm,
yeah,
I mean, you kill Laymore in Azure Vault. You have to run down the stairs and pull the rocks.
right.
I feel like that's about the same amount of time.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
So
Um,
it doesn't bother me that much.
okay.
And I think that because of the way that they changed the trash going into season, like into the season, there's no more double Thundercaller packs.
Yeah, yeah,
They just cleared a lot of that trash out of there. Um, so the speed buff gets you to your next like fight
pretty
quickly,
quickly.
but you actually use it, right? You don't have to like sneak around, or you don't run back to the bottom of the stairs after Herja and immediately go into combat. Like you do actually have a little bit of a distance to travel, so it feels like the speed buff is worth it and
Yeah,
valuable. So I don't know that it like is
detracts from it.
useless and detracts from it. So
Okay,
that doesn't bother me too much.
I'll say that for me, the trash in this dungeon is actually pretty cool. I have fun on fortified weeks. Kind of like it's fun to you pull a bunch of stuff and you set who's interrupting what, right? You do the double pull in the hallway. All that is really cool. Some of the bosses in this dungeon, and it's a 5 boss dungeon, I think I'll say 2 of them are completely trash. I think the first boss, Himdall and God King Skovald, are both just terrible bosses. God King Skovald in particular, I think, is a really just a bad boss. It was terrible in Legion. It was horribly designed in Legion, and it still is, right? Um, what do you think?
Yes, God King's Cobalt doesn't feel like a boss, really. He
Yeah, it doesn't
feels
feel like a
like,
boss. He doesn't really do anything. He's got like 2 mechanics, right? And one of them you just stand behind a shield for. It's kind of weird.
yeah. Himdall, I'm actually a fan of Himdall. I mean, he's not hard, but dance bosses are kind of fun.
Okay.
Um, it's mostly, single target Zerg the boss down, just don't get hit by the breath.
Yep.
Um, so, I mean, it's not hard, um, but I think it's kind
Right.
of fun just
Okay.
because you have to,
Yeah.
the
I think
tanks have to be
it ends
aware.
up it ends up taking too long. It just feels like it takes too long on tyrannical weeks, and you do like 7 or 8 breaths, and you're just like, okay, it's kind of repetitive. I don't know. This just might be an old dungeon phenomenon where there's just not that many what's the word? There's not that many like synergistic mechanics with the boss, right? It's kind of the breath and the tornadoes, and then there's the blade, and then the tank gets hit with a bleed, and that's like the whole boss. Um,
Yeah. I I know it might take a little bit longer, but I don't think it's typically a problem. A lot of times you'll see like a long dungeon or a long fight, and you feel like you're losing something because of it, right? But you pull Himdall, your Lust is on cooldown because you use it on the first pack, and you're gonna kill the boss eventually. And then people have figured out how to pull the dungeon that you can get to Herja and be ready to pull her pretty much as soon as Lust comes off cooldown.
yep.
And I don't ever feel punished by the first boss
Taking a
where
long
I'm
time.
like, yeah, and like sometimes your key might be suffering from not doing enough damage. Low DPS is definitely a problem. But you realize early enough into that key that you're just not gonna be able to time it that you don't ever feel like you wasted your time because you
E-
you know 20 minutes in
yes.
pretty well.
So okay, overall, I don't actually hate this dungeon, and I think a lot of people do. Um, I think it's very difficult and challenging, and some not necessarily in the most um exciting ways, but I don't hate it. I'm not mad about going to Hav usually. Um, so I'm putting this in B tier. I don't think it's better than Academy though. Well, any
I think it
thoughts?
is better than Academy.
You think it's better than Academy? Okay.
Yes, I think so because there are ways that you can force yourself to time that key. And I don't think Academy has that. We talked about the timer.
Hmm.
38 minutes might be a little tight. 40 minutes might have been a little better.
Right.
30, even 39 minutes might have been a little better. But because you can pull all the bears, you can pull all the wolves, you can pull the buffaloes. You can find ways to save time. Um, you know, Personally, I think it's better design
Hmm.
and maybe equal amount of fun. And
Interesting. Interesting. Okay. I definitely have more fun in Academy than Halls. I'll say that. But
maybe that's just a tank thing for me
maybe,
because
yeah.
I think pulling bears is fun.
Okay.
Buffaloes is pretty fun. I generally have a pretty good time in there, but uh, I
Yeah.
I can accept why somebody would have more fun out.
Okay. Um, I'll leave it here. You can convince me later, maybe. Um, I'll say they're close. They're close. They're similar dungeons too. I think they feel similar, right? Kind of tight timers, hard bosses, a lot of trash, um, a lot of tricks, a lot of tech. So we'll see. Yeah.
Yeah, and then like kind of was mentioned where you know whether or not you're going to time halls pretty early on.
Yeah.
Like Algethar is a big fat question mark until you are halfway done with the last boss.
Pretty much right. Pretty much you should know after you kill Veximus. If you have like 8 or 9 minutes, you should be okay. Something like that.
Yeah, I guess that's fair. It's about the same amount
Yeah.
of time then, because like if you kill Fenrir in 22 minutes, you're going to be okay.
Right. Right. Okay. Nokhud Offensive. So this is the longest dungeon of the season, right? 40 minutes. And you can fly. So there's a lot of stuff to do in here. And originally I was like, I didn't like it because it felt too long. But nowadays, as I do it, it really doesn't feel that long at all. Like when I'm in there, even though it's 38, 39 minutes. And I think that's because there's just a lot to do in here, for from a healing perspective at least. I think for DPS players as well, there's this is one of those dungeons where you get to just blast a lot of the time, and there's great big packs of like 7, 8 mobs and stuff, especially in the third area, and I think that's fun. Um, I think that's fun and good design. I wish they have more dungeons where there's a lot of trash. I think people enjoy that in general. I think boss wise, I like the last or the I like the three that aren't the first boss. I think the first boss is really boring and feels like it's missing a mechanic almost. Like it feels like there was a mechanic there that they kind of took out or something. I'm not sure, but um, yeah, it's just like the ballistas and you run around and do those, and that's the whole boss, right? Um, but what are your thoughts on Nokud?
Nokud is really cool. It's it's nice that it's a 40-minute timer. It's nice that it's four bosses because they balance the trash pretty well. That you get about 25% trash in each boss area.
Yeah, yeah, I did notice that too.
That it's really easy to know where you're at. You kill Granite in 10 minutes, you're doing okay. Second boss done in 20 minutes,
20
you're doing
minutes.
okay.
Yep.
Um, Obviously we pull a lot more trash in the third boss area, uh, but the count is actually pretty high, so you don't feel like you are doing a million trash packs. It's just there's a
It
lot of
doesn't feel
value
like
in
you're
the
wasting
packs that you're
time.
killing,
It doesn't feel like you're
right?
wasting time. Yeah, yeah.
And you can reasonably double up some of the pulls. You can pull the birds down on top of the first hill, and blast that down. Maybe it's a little bit scarier during like bolstering week, but Sanguine is kind of the only affix in that dungeon where you're just like, oh, I'm not doing this week.
Right, right.
But Sanguine is an affix where you don't want to go into most dungeons.
Yeah.
So I don't think that's a problem with the dungeon. You know, it's definitely a dungeon where if you kill the third boss in 30 minutes, kind of along that same timeline, you feel like you're doing okay. But it's definitely a key where you can look up and be like, man, we were blasting. Where's all the time go?
Yes, that's happened to me a number of times. Get to the last boss and suddenly there's 6 minutes left, right? And you're like, wait, do we have enough here? And,
Yeah. Maybe some of that's the travel. But I think like the two lieutenant mobs that you have to kill before the last boss, they take a lot of time.
right. And
It
those
can be a
often
bit.
get skipped in hierarchies with the
Yeah.
Shadow Meld or whatever.
Yep. And I think that's great. That's the counterplay that you want to see. If you don't have to pull them, why should you? And I think a lot of people were really worried about that key in M0 week when you were going around the front and walking up the hill through the gates and killing all
Yep.
that crap.
And people
People were
found
like,
the
yeah, they found the ledge that you can just fly to, and everybody does it. And you just pull the last boss, and I think that's great. I think that it's a pretty well designed dungeon. Um,
I don't think it's better than Azure Vault. I don't know if it's S tier. I vote for A, but it is good, and I have a good time in here every time. I think the bosses are really. I think the second boss is really cool, just conceptually, and it's a lot of fun to heal. And I like bosses where they give you a buff. I'm just a sucker for that, right? So you got people running around picking up the orbs, and you have to do that to time the boss or to kill the boss. Sorry, but I like that kind of stuff. So
and it's good because like not only is it an HPS buff, but also DPS buff, so everybody's
yep,
happy about it.
everyone's happy.
And like everybody, it's designed in such a way that it's doing the mechanics at the same time, right? So you know, your melee DPS who just want to press their buttons, they're going to do the mechanics to the fight correctly because they want to do more damage. And
Yep.
I think that's great. I
Yep.
would definitely say it's better than the other three that we've rated: Core Stars, Algethar, and Halls of Valor. So I'm happy with A tier.
Okay. And
Am I
not better
excited to
than
go
AB.
back?
Yeah.
Uh, yeah, I would say so. I'm definitely excited to go back. It helps that it is a really good loot dungeon. You've got
Mm-hmm.
Rage Feather, you've got Tank Trinket, you've got a like a strength one-handed sword. You've got
There's a Warglaive,
there's a
I think,
yeah,
right?
there's a Warglaive
Yep.
that's really good. So there's a lot of people that want to sign up and do that key. You see it really popular at the +2 level, at the +10, +16. Like everybody's pretty happy to go into Nokhud. So
Yep.
it's
Which
pretty
is
good,
interesting
solid
because it
key.
is the longest dungeon, right? But you see like it's definitely on there with like people are okay doing it. I think it's one of the ones that people are okay to sign up for, right? So I agree with that. Okay, we got a few left here. So RLP is really interesting. So we might have different opinions here because I think this is a really out of all these 8, this is the healer dungeon, right? I think all healers would agree with that. Um, it's interesting how the throughput requirement for Ruby is just so much higher than all these other dungeons. And it's kind of consistent. Like everything in here just requires a lot of healing, except the first trash area. Um, and I really like that. I like the challenge that it presents. I like these bosses that were originally pretty hard and got nerfed a couple times, and now I think they're within reason, but they're all very challenging. All 3 of these are quite a challenge. Um, and then you come in on Fortified Week, and the trash in the second and third areas are very difficult and require good cooldown management and good interrupts and whatever. Um, I think I think it's a great dungeon. I I like the challenge. I'll just put it that way.
I think it's a really good healer dungeon. I think it's a really good tank dungeon. I think DPS hate doing it,
Yep.
and it was definitely too hard in the beginning. And I think people's opinion carried over to the rest of the season, similar to what we saw with Azure Vault.
Yes. I think the reason DPS hate doing it is because they don't feel like they have control over what's happening, right? Because so much of the burden falls to your healer and your tank, right? Especially on like the first boss, the first and second bosses. If you don't have a good healer or tank there, they're just dead, right? Like your party's just dead, and as a DPS player, it's like, what am I supposed to do there, right?
Yeah, for sure. There's definitely a lot of tests, I guess, that your team has to pass. Like your healer has to be able to kill the first boss. Um, your tank needs to be able to survive a couple of different pulls with the way that you have to double it,
Hmm.
and then everybody has to be able to survive the last trash pack before the third boss.
Right. So yeah, I can see how DPS don't like this dungeon.
It's
Uh,
probably the most mechanically complex dungeon
I don't know if I
that
agree
we
with that.
have. Really?
Do you agree? Like boss wise, or just in general?
I think trash wise, I think that's where we see a lot of
Okay.
problems. Um, there's a lot
Okay.
of
Interesting.
knocks that you have to have or
Yeah. Yeah.
stuns, and um, because the way you have to like such a short timer that you have to double and triple pull a lot of it. There's a lot of interrupts that you have to time correct,
Right.
or do
Like
correctly.
in the first area,
Um,
especially.
yeah, you just have to play super well. Fortunately,
Yes.
because it's a short timer, and especially like with the amount of trash that you have to get before the first boss, you know whether or not you're going to even complete that dungeon very early on. Um,
Hmm.
and then sometimes you even save yourself 5 6 minutes uh, going in after you kill the second boss that you can just hearth out,
Yep.
and that feels punishing. And I don't think it's unfairly punishing though. I think it's you just have to play super well.
No, that's the thing about Ruby. I feel like everything in here is fair. As a healer, I think all the damage just feels natural, and it's a lot, but it's like it's just what you have to do, and it doesn't feel like I can't do it. You know what I mean? Um, it's a really like, if we play well dungeon, then it's definitely the timer is very okay. There's not that much, run time, right? It's just three bosses. It's not too long. It's really a did you play well dungeon, and I think that's cool. So for me, it's somewhere in A tier. I don't think it's better than Nokhud. Um, I don't know.
I I like where you put it. A tier for me.
Okay,
I can think of a handful of times where I bricked that key, and it's because I didn't play well. I don't think there's
same,
anything in that
same.
dungeon where I'm like, oh my gosh, just a lot of you might see bad
No
spell queuing
way. Yes,
in
which we'll
some
talk about.
bosses.
We'll talk about in a second here.
Yeah, we'll talk about that here in just a
What
second.
is wrong
But
with this fucking boss?
you can run into a handful of
All right,
issues,
calm
but
down, calm down.
almost always that happens because it was of what you did versus what the dungeon did
Right.
to you.
Yep.
Even
Um.
sanguine is really not that bad because most of the stuff can be knocked.
Yep.
You can displace almost all of the trash there.
I actually found
It's
this dungeon really, really interesting on Sanguine Week, and I think I timed my first 24 on Sanguine Week, and it was like the way people played around the Sanguine in the key that I was in was just really, really cool. And it felt really good to see everyone kind of play that well and manage the dungeon like that, because it is a very hard Sanguine dungeon, right? If you Sanguine something large like a caster in the third area, you're just screwed. Um, so okay.
yeah,
So you like it here?
I think that's a great place to put it.
All right, cool. So let's move on to the easiest dungeon of the tier, right? Shadowmoon Burial Grounds. I want to ask you first off before we get into it. Like when we first stepped in here, what did you think of this place? Like in the first couple weeks.
So in Shadowlands season 4, when we got to vote on the dungeons that we wanted to do,
Yeah.
I actually voted for this dungeon.
Yep.
It was one of my favorites to do in Warlords of Draenor. Uh, I will admit that I was not a very good player back then. I was definitely a casual Andy. So Shadowmoon was just a fun dungeon to do. I liked the theme. I liked
It looks
that we
cool, right?
it looked cool. I liked that we got to see Ner'zhul, even if people were disappointed that you killed Ner'zhul. who's such a huge character, as a boss in a dungeon rather
Mm-hmm.
than seeing him in a raid.
Right, right.
I care about that less than other people, so it didn't bother me that much. But it was cool, and I enjoyed it, so I voted for it. And I was disappointed that people voted for Grimmail Depot instead
Oh, in season 4, you mean?
in season four.
Okay, yeah, yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
then going into Dragonflight, when they said, "Okay, we're going to do Shadowmoon Battlegrounds," I was pumped. I was like, "Oh yeah, like I love doing that." It was fun. I didn't do Warlords challenge modes.
Challenge mode.
So I didn't have any concept of whether or not it was a good timer or anything, or whether or not it was an easy dungeon. I just enjoyed doing it. So I was pumped. And then it was the dungeon to do at every level going in the
Really,
early
every level.
at every level in the early phases of the season.
Yeah.
So it was, spent a lot of time in there, got really good at it. Plenty of guildies who, didn't do a ton of Mythic Plus. They would, need to get their weekly keys in.
It's Shadowmoon,
So,
right?
yep, it's
SPG
Shadowmoon.
20. Let's go. Bring the whole family. Bring your sister. Um,
It was everybody's first 20.
yep.
And honestly, I think 20 and below, maybe 22 and below, I think it's a good dungeon to have so that people can time
It's a
stuff,
good
right?
just slammer, right? You just slam it, and
Yep.
people can time it, and they're right. So
But if you're
I
looking at the dungeon as a
yes,
whole, design not so good, and it's probably the biggest like tell that the it didn't hold up.
I'd say now this is definitely my least favorite dungeon of the tier. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I would say so.
Okay.
It's a homework key. We've done it a million times, and it didn't hold up. There's not a ton of trash. Um, the first pack in the dungeon you have to skip,
You just skip it,
just
right?
because it's so inefficient. And that pack, and then the pack before the first boss, those are the worst trash packs in the entire season. I detest doing those packs as a tank.
Right. It's just a lot of just it's just damage that like there's no real like counterplay to it besides kiting, right? It's just there. It's just a thing that does a lot of damage to the tank. It's like why? Um, for me, these bosses, two of the bosses, the two middle bosses, um, just don't do anything, right? Like the worm boss doesn't do anything, and also has like these weird spell queuing interactions, and also has this thing where like melee abilities can't hit it because it's like in the water, so they have to stand kind of on the edge right under the worm in order to hit it with blade dance or fist of fury or whatever. It I think it was even something that they couldn't fix. Like the fact that they didn't fix it means that it was unable to be fixed. Um, which begs the question of like why did they include this? I don't know. Um, it's
I
just a lot
think.
of like you know what I mean. It just doesn't feel like there's much to do in here, right?
Do you think your opinion would change if it were like a 30-minute timer?
No, 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 no. Because it's not the timer it's not the easiness of the dungeon that's the issue for me. It's the fact that like there's just not enough mechanics. There's not enough things to do. So that's for me how it doesn't hold up in 2023. There's just not enough mechanics.
Yeah, that's fair. The the most interesting trash is the spiders and the bats, and those are just like your average trash pack that you
Yes,
see in a lot of other dungeons.
right. There's a couple
Pick
interrupts,
this,
like a
couple
couple stuns or
interrupts,
whatever.
and it's fun. People enjoy doing it because there's the skirrers that you get to pull into it, and you do a bunch of damage. But other than that, like the rest of the rest of the trash is unexciting. There's not a lot of it. You get a ton of count in every single pack.
Mm-hmm.
The worms, you can pull one pack of bats into them, and that's about it. Yeah, I mean, there's the tech where you can jump behind the invisible wall and pull the spiders into the second worm, um, which is interesting, but it's about the only interesting thing that you can do. And then the blueberries before the last boss, those are punishing on most affix combos,
Right.
and it's it's a pack that you have to lust on 4 or 5 weeks. So
I'll say
I don't.
that those two are definitely the highlight of the dungeon for me, and that's not not putting it kindly. I don't like I like doing them, but that's the highlight of the dungeon for me, if that makes
Yeah, but
sense.
there's nothing interesting about them. You just
Right.
like healers are masochists who like to get challenged,
Yes.
right?
Yeah.
They
Yeah.
like to get told that they can't do something,
Yes.
and proving everybody wrong. But it's not good trash. It does
No.
uninterruptible channels. If you sanguine a blueberry in a normal dungeon, that breaks your key.
It heals
But
to 100, right?
yeah. If you heal a blueberry from 10% to 100, you lose your two chest at a 28, right?
Right.
And I don't think the timer's too long. It's
Yes.
very easy at just about every level, and that's a good thing to have. There should always be an easiest key, but it is
It's too
so
easy.
easy.
It's too easy. There's nothing to do in there. Yeah. I just think the disparity between Shadowmoon and like all the other dungeons in terms of difficulty is just they had to have done something with this tuning wise, um, either with the timer or they needed to add some more trash or something. I think that would have been a good thing to do was to add a couple different trash packs in there or something like they did with Temple. They did it with or I mean mainly Temple, right, which we'll talk about in a second. But it's just too easy and there's nothing going on in here. And the disparity between this and everything else is just too obvious. If you look at the ratings, or sorry, the completion rate, Shadowmoon sits at like 95%, which is way too high for a dungeon. That's just too high for a dungeon, right?
That is extremely high. I like what you
Yeah.
put here at D tier. I think that's about all it can be, even though it's everybody's like best key
Yeah.
and the one they run the most. So kind of disappointing
Right.
to see how that one played out.
Really recently, like pretty much everyone, like all the groups I've run with, I kind of asked them like, are you tired of Shadowmoon? And everyone really just says yes. I think everyone's just tired of this place. Um, yeah, it's nothing more to say.
I'm curious if we see the same thing in Freehold in season two.
Freehold? No, I don't think so. I think Freehold has more going for it than Shadowmoon, right?
Yeah, I guess we will see.
Do
I
do you
guess the
mean
Freehold
like
conversation is
being too
probably
easy or like being probably the easiest key of the season? I'm not sure. I'm not sure it will be. First of all,
that's fair. We're probably running into different video territory, but yeah, I think you might be right.
yeah, yeah. Maybe we'll make a season two prediction, right?
Yeah, we can talk
We'll
about
see.
that.
All right, let's wrap this guy up. TJS, last one here. This is from Miss Pandaria. So another old dungeon. It's funny. I stepped into a time walking this week, right, and got temple for the. No, sorry, it wasn't time walking. It was just a mist dungeon, a leveling dungeon, and it didn't occur to me like actually how much trash they added to this place, right? If you go through on just the regular mop dungeon, there's almost no trash in here, but all the trash like before the last boss is added, and that trash pack, the last trash pack. Let's start there. Why?
Yeah, I all of that trash after the third boss is not fun. I don't think it's terribly well designed.
No,
The Mistweaver packs are not super good. Uh,
it's too many kicks. First of all, like it's too many interrupts for the majority of party like class compositions to handle. And of course now we have prop pally on the rise, but before that it was just like all the casts are going off, and it's like, what are we supposed to do here?
yeah, I think the biggest offender is obviously everybody's going to say it is the last pack. I think if you
Yes,
don't have that last pack there, you just have the Mistweaver packs. I think that trash is probably reasonable, and maybe our opinion is a little bit different. Um, I think the changes that they did to Wise Mari were actually really good.
I
I know
think they're
that's
good. I think they're good.
a bit of a resident sleeper boss for a lot of people. The If there was a betting line for over under on how many people are going to die on this boss, the answer is almost always the over. But I think that's
It's always Shadow Priest and Boomkins, dude. I don't know
it's
what it is. I don't know what it is about them.
People have a hard time staying alive on that boss, but I don't think there's too many problems with the mechanics themselves. They don't mesh very well with affixes though. Quaking
Hmm.
Wisemari is a bad time. Is but
Storming is a really bad time.
Storming is a bad time, and a lot of time Thundering is a bad time.
Yep.
So man, the affixes don't play very well, but it's definitely it's the easiest part of that dungeon. So it's you're not losing time most of the time. So I think that's okay that they don't mesh up super well.
Right.
Um,
Um, I think it was an interesting. I don't know if this is what you meant, but like you said about the last trash pack, like now I'm thinking, what if it wasn't there, right? If the dungeon was exactly the same, but they took the last trash bag out, I think it'd actually be a reasonable dungeon, like timer wise. For a lot of groups, it's a timer issue, right? In
mhm.
here on tyrannical weeks, the last boss takes like 6 minutes. 30 minutes is just really hard to time this dungeon. Maybe not having the last trash pack would make this more reasonable. I don't know.
I don't know the statistics, so I'm just guessing, but I suspect that it would be timed a lot more at the 20 to 24 level.
Yeah.
Um, I like specifically that last pack. Like the timer stays the same, or maybe if the timer goes down a little bit, just that last pack is so difficult to just kill.
Hmm.
Tanks have a hard time staying alive. DPS have a hard time kicking the right stuff. It's just
You
that
end up
pack is just a
having
mess.
to dump a lot of cooldowns into it too, which I think is one of the reasons the last boss takes so long. Um,
Yep,
so
you have to lust that if you
unfortified,
like if
yeah,
yeah you have to lust it on fortified, and then the last boss takes longer. I think that last pack is just the egregious part of it. The rest of it is mostly okay. I think the design is pretty good.
yep.
The way you pull the courtyard is interesting. Having the pat. Um,
There's a lot of variance there too with how
yep.
people
Yeah,
want to pull it.
you don't pull it the same way every time. I think that's cool. Even though it's pretty static. I mean, it's just one tiny little area. Um, but you decide how you want to do it. You want to pull the fat guy in with the pack that you're fighting now, and it's
Yep.
not always the same.
Right.
So I think that's interesting. I think that's good. Skipping the pandas is high key tech. I would say most key levels skip the pandas. Um,
Yeah, I think
Probably
people
20
started to
plus.
realize that they weren't worth pulling.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The I really liked that they changed the second boss, even though the second boss is boring. I like that it's always the same. I think that's something that I would love to see in Freehold in season two. Is the second boss always have the same rotation? I doubt that's
Right.
going to be the case,
I
especially
doubt
what we're
it.
seeing
Yeah.
in PTR. But I think that's a good thing to have. I think the week to week variance on like your council bosses is maybe not as good.
Right.
So
Um,
that was a nice change that I like seeing. And the third boss is very difficult, especially for tanks. But it's a skill issue.
it is a
I
very
don't.
skill oriented boss. I think.
Yeah, I don't feel punished by the dungeon itself. Like you need to
Interesting.
cycle your. Well, I don't feel punished by the boss itself. I guess
Okay.
like you need to use your cooldowns correctly, obviously, but like that's good. But being able to avoid the damage in P3 when you're fighting the dragon is good. And then you just need to move fast enough that you don't get hit by the
Right.
beam. Um,
Yeah.
so for me, I think tier wise, oh man, it's so hard.
This one's tough. This one is tough. I agree. Here.
Design,
Yeah.
fun are B tier. Am I excited? Like,
Would you want to go
what?
back in again?
No, and I don't think it's because of the dungeon. I think it's because of the timer, um, and that trash pack. I,
Yep.
I, I think it's kind of one of those things that needs the Azure Vault treatment. I think the timer needs to go up by 90 seconds,
Yeah.
and I think they need to either nerf that trash pack or take it out.
Yep.
Uh,
I think putting something smaller in its place, or maybe just like maybe just the one, maybe just the one fat guy, and then you can decide if you want to pull that with something else at the end, right? but to have all the
Yeah.
Dark Claw mobs attached to it and the Haunting Shaw, it's just like it's just too much. Um,
If you wanted to do the Azure Vault treatment, just reduce the frequency at which they cast the Dark Claw, and
right.
you're fine.
My
Like
suggestion
if
was like the problem with Dark Claw is that it's actually pretty hard to stop. And I think, well, you tell me, is that the one that you can outrange, or is that the one that you can't? I think it is the one you
you
can
can,
outrange, right?
yeah, that's the one that you can outrange.
But it's very difficult to do because the cast time is
It's
so short.
the issue is, yeah, it's like a 0.5 second cast time and like a weak aura. That's a, I use Ellesmere's wonderful weak aura where
Mhm.
I'm hit with Details Gun 1 every time they hit that cast, but there's so many of them that you're just that's all you're doing.
Right.
So if they made it like a 2 second cast
That would have been
and
my
you cast
suggestion. That would have been my
make it
suggestion.
make
Yeah.
it a 2 second cast and they cast it every 10 seconds, and if you could stack them up and stun them
Hmm.
as necessary, I think that'd be a awesome trash back. I think it'd be really cool.
Right. So I
So
actually don't. I don't hate this place either. I think that's what you're getting at, right? Um, I think like challenge wise, it from a healer perspective, it's quite the challenge, especially on fortified weeks. Actually, doing a lot of the courtyard trash and the exploding shaws and stuff, it's quite a challenge. Um, I'll agree with the things you said, in that I probably don't want to step in here again. But design wise and fun wise, actually not too bad. I don't hate my life when I'm in here for the most part. Sometimes I do. If it's like bolstering week or something, it's not a great time. But um, what are you thinking? I think it's B tier.
I think
I,
bottom
I'm
of B. I
I'm
have way
gonna
more
put
fun in
it.
halls
You have
than
more
I
fun in
do.
halls.
Oh yeah.
Okay, I think that's right. I think that's right then. Um, are you C tier for this? Like,
No, I don't think it deserves its own tier. I think there's times that I've gone into temple and actually had a good time. I think C
mhm.
tier and D tier would be generally unfavorable dungeons. Um, and I don't always feel that way. I do wish I had better loot, but that's a that's a
Oh, the
separate
loot is really
conversation.
bad in there. Um, yeah, yeah.
So yeah, bottom of B I think is fine. Or
Okay.
we don't have a great definition for C tier, but I don't feel strongly enough that I would want to move it down.
C tier, I would say there should be like major design flaws. Um, like Shadowmoon, for example, for me has some really horrible design flaws and kind of just bugs and whatnot. That really should just put it down here, right? But C tier would be like the dungeon's okay. There's just a lot of stuff wrong with it, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
So I don't think Temple belongs there, right?
yeah, I think so. I think I'm happy with where we left it.
Okay. Um. So
Did you want to
yeah,
rank
I think.
the Dragonflight dungeons going into season 3?
I mean, I think this is basically. You mean that the four that are coming back, right?
Mm-hmm.
This is basically how I'd rank them, right? Just
Yeah, I
AV,
would say
Nokhud,
so.
Ruby, and Algethar in that order, probably.
Yeah, I think so.
Yep. And it's possible they'll make some changes to Algethar that, as I said, for me, Academy was very close to being S tier. With a few changes, a few tuning things here and there, I could see this becoming an S tier dungeon. Because there's a lot of great stuff in here, and I think it's fun.
Yeah, I think tuning is the only thing that stops any of those dungeons from being S tier.
Hmm.
I don't think there's any major issues. So definitely
Okay.
excited.
Yeah, I'm excited for season 3. I'm very excited for season 2. Um, I think the dungeon set is going to be fresh. First of all, obviously it's new, but I think it's going to be challenging in a good way. Based on what I've seen and heard so far, I think people are, for the most part, pretty excited, and especially with the new kind of affix changes and stuff they've changed recently. It's looking up to be a good season. So looking forward to that. So anything you want to add? Otherwise, we'll just wrap up here. And I think I like kind of how these turned out.
Yeah, I think I'm all good. Thanks for having me on.
Yep. All right. Thank you for coming. This is my friend Brass. I'm sure you'll see him around if you pop into my streams. We do keys pretty often together. Um, But yeah, that's pretty much it. Putting the final touches on what I thought was a really good season. Played more than I ever thought I would this season. And I really enjoyed the vast majority of these dungeons, I think. All right. We'll stop it here then. Thanks for watching.